Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead as he pushed the industrial mop across the marble floor of the corporate building. It was 6 a.m., and the city was just waking up, but he had already been working for 2 hours. The security guard nodded at him as he passed by, recognizing the quiet man who came in every morning before dawn to clean the offices of one of the most successful tech companies in the country. What the security guard didn't know, what none of his coworkers knew, was that Marcus went home every night to a penthouse apartment where his wife Sarah was the CEO of a billion-dollar corporation. The same building he cleaned housed her biggest competitors' offices, and the irony wasn't lost on him. Marcus had chosen this job deliberately. After 20 years of commanding an elite military unit, after operations that required split-second decisions and lives hanging in the balance, he found peace in the simple rhythm of cleaning. The repetitive motions, the quiet halls, the satisfaction of leaving everything spotless. It was his meditation, his way of healing from wounds that nobody could see. Sarah had tried to understand when he first told her about his decision. She had offered him executive positions at her company, partnerships with other firms, anything that would match his military experience and leadership skills. But Marcus had looked at her with those steady green eyes that had once commanded respect from soldiers twice his size and simply said, "I need this." Their marriage had always been unconventional. They met at a charity gala where Sarah was being honored as Young Entrepreneur of the Year, and Marcus was there in his dress uniform, representing his unit at a fundraiser for veteran services. She was drawn to his quiet confidence, the way he listened more than he spoke, and how he seemed completely unimpressed by her wealth and success. Marcus had been leading Delta Force operations when most people his age were still figuring out their careers. He had parachuted into hostile territories, coordinated rescue missions that saved hundreds of lives, and made decisions under pressure that most people couldn't imagine. His unit trusted him completely because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and he never left anyone behind. But after 2 decades of that life, something inside him had broken. Not dramatically, not in a way that made headlines or required hospitalization. It was quieter than that, like a hairline crack in a foundation that slowly spreads until the whole structure needs rebuilding. The last mission had been in Afghanistan. His team had been tasked with extracting a diplomat's family from a compound that had been overrun by insurgents. Everything had gone according to plan until they were leaving. A young soldier, barely 22, had stepped on an IED that their intelligence had missed. Marcus had made the choice to go back for him, even though protocol suggested they should leave him behind to save the rest of the team. They had saved the soldier, but Marcus carried him out while under heavy fire. The boy lived, went home to his family in Ohio, and Marcus received another commendation for his actions. But something in him had finally reached its limit. He realized he had been running on empty for years, making life and death decisions while his own soul slowly died. When he met Sarah 6 months after his retirement, she represented everything he wasn't: forward-thinking, optimistic about the future, building something instead of protecting or destroying. Her technology company was developing software that helped small businesses manage their finances more efficiently. While he had spent years learning how to end things, she was creating tools that helped things grow. Their courtship was unusual. Marcus would pick her up from board meetings in his old pickup truck, taking her to diners instead of fancy restaurants. Sarah, who was used to men who wanted to impress her with their own success, was charmed by someone who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and dreams rather than her bank account. When they married, the media had a field day. The business magazines ran stories about the CEO who married a war hero. Military publications wrote about the decorated officer who had found love with a corporate powerhouse. But neither Marcus nor Sarah read those articles. They were too busy figuring out how to build a life together. The transition to civilian life had been harder than Marcus expected. He had tried working as a security consultant, then as a trainer for law enforcement agencies, but everything felt like an extension of his military life, keeping him trapped in the same mindset that had nearly consumed him. He needed something completely different, something that would allow his mind to rest while his body stayed busy. That's when he had walked into the employment office and asked about janitorial work. The woman behind the desk had looked at his resume with confusion. Seeing military decorations and leadership positions, then looking at this man asking to clean buildings. Marcus had simply said he was looking for honest work that would allow him to think clearly. Now, 18 months later, he had found his rhythm. He would wake up at 4 a.m., kiss Sarah goodbye as she slept, and drive to work in his maintenance uniform. He would spend his day making sure everything was clean and orderly, taking pride in small details that most people never noticed. His co-workers respected him because he worked hard and never complained, though they sometimes wondered about the man who seemed overqualified for the job, but never acted like he was too good for it. In the evenings, he would come home to find Sarah either still at the office or working from her home study. They would have dinner together, sharing stories about their very different days. She would tell him about board meetings and product launches, and he would tell her about the small satisfactions of his work, a particularly stubborn stain that finally came clean, or helping a new employee who seemed nervous about starting their job. Their friends didn't understand, and their families thought Marcus was having some kind of breakdown. But Sarah could see what others missed. Her husband was healing, finding himself again in the simple dignity of honest work. The man who had once carried wounded soldiers out of combat zones now carried himself with the same quiet strength, just in a very different uniform. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while Marcus was restocking supplies in the janitor's closet. His supervisor, Janet, found him there with an expression he couldn't read. She was holding the company phone, and her voice was unusually formal when she spoke. "Marcus, there's been an incident. Building management needs to see you upstairs immediately." Marcus felt his old instincts kick in. In his military days, urgent summons meant crisis, and crisis meant someone needed his help. He followed Janet to the elevator, noting how other employees seemed to be staring at him as they passed. Something had changed in the building's atmosphere, and he could sense it the way he used to sense danger in hostile territory. The building manager, Mr. Peterson, was waiting in his office along with two people Marcus didn't recognize, a woman in an expensive suit and a man with the bearing of someone used to authority. Peterson looked uncomfortable, shuffling papers on his desk before finally speaking. "Marcus, we've discovered something about your background that wasn't disclosed on your employment application." Marcus remained calm, though his mind was already calculating possibilities. He had been honest about his military service, though he hadn't gone into detail about his specific role or security clearance. Most civilian employers didn't need to know that he had once been responsible for operations that remained classified. The woman in the suit spoke next. "Mr. Chen, I'm Agent Rodriguez with the Department of Homeland Security. We've been conducting routine background checks on all personnel who have access to this building, and your military record raised some flags." Marcus almost smiled at the irony. Here he was, being investigated for security risks while mopping the floors of a building that housed 3 different defense contractors and a company that managed federal databases. His security clearance had been higher than anyone else in the building, including the executives who made 10 times his salary. "What kind of flags?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. Agent Rodriguez consulted her tablet. "Your service record shows involvement in classified operations across multiple theaters. You have training in explosives, communications, intelligence gathering, and tactical operations. The question is why someone with your background is working as maintenance staff with access to sensitive areas." Peterson jumped in, clearly nervous. "Marcus, you understand our position. We can't have someone with your capabilities having unsupervised access to all these offices. There are proprietary documents, computer systems, client information." Marcus looked at each of them, recognizing the fear in their eyes. They weren't seeing him as Marcus the janitor who fixed broken toilets and always remembered to refill the coffee supplies. They were seeing him as a potential threat, someone whose skills could be used for purposes they couldn't understand or control. "I clean floors," Marcus said simply. "I empty trash cans and restock paper towels. I've been doing this job for over a year, and I've never accessed any information that wasn't part of my normal duties." The man who had been silent finally spoke. Marcus recognized him now as the head of security for the building's main tenant, a defense contractor called Precision Systems. "The problem isn't what you've done, it's what you could do. Your background suggests capabilities that go far beyond what this job requires." Marcus felt a familiar weariness settle over him. This was exactly what he had been trying to escape. The assumption that his past defined his present, that his training made him dangerous even when he was choosing not to use it. He had hoped that by taking such an obviously different path, people would see him for who he was now, not who he had been. "I chose this job," Marcus said, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "I have other options. My wife could have gotten me any position I wanted in her company or a dozen others. I chose to clean buildings because it's honest work that lets me sleep at night." Agent Rodriguez made a note on her tablet. "Your wife is Sarah Chen, CEO of Innovative Solutions. That raises additional questions about your motivations. Why would someone married to a woman worth $50 million choose to work for minimum wage in a building that houses her competitors?" Marcus realized they had investigated more than just his military background. They knew about Sarah's company, probably knew about their finances, their social connections, maybe even their private conversations if they had been monitoring communications. The paranoia that had kept him alive in combat zones started to resurface. "Because I'm not my wife," Marcus said. "Her success doesn't define my worth, and my past doesn't define my intentions." Peterson looked relieved when Agent Rodriguez seemed to accept this explanation. "Nevertheless, we're going to have to make some changes to your security access. You'll be assigned to floors that don't house sensitive operations, and you'll need to be accompanied by security personnel when accessing certain areas." Marcus nodded, understanding that this was their compromise. They couldn't legally fire him without cause, but they could make his job more difficult and less satisfying. The freedom he had found in being trusted to work alone, to take pride in maintaining the entire building, was being taken away. After the meeting, Marcus found himself in the break room with Janet, who looked embarrassed about the whole situation. She had worked with him every day for over a year and had seen nothing but reliability and professionalism. "I'm sorry about this, Marcus. I told them you were one of the best employees we've ever had, but they're scared of lawyers and liability issues." Marcus poured himself coffee from the machine he had cleaned and maintained every day. "It's not your fault, Janet. People see what they expect to see." That evening, Marcus came home to find Sarah waiting for him with dinner already prepared. She took one look at his face and knew something had happened. Over the years, she had learned to read the subtle changes in his expression, the way his military bearing became more pronounced when he was dealing with stress. "What happened?" she asked, setting down her fork. Marcus told her about the investigation, the meeting, the new restrictions on his work. Sarah listened without interrupting, her business mind already calculating implications and solutions. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "They're idiots," she finally said. "Anyone who's worked with you for 5 minutes can see that you're exactly who you appear to be. Honest, hardworking, and completely trustworthy." Marcus reached across the table to take her hand. "They're scared. I understand that. In their position, I might have the same concerns." Sarah shook her head. "No, you wouldn't. You know how to judge character because you've had to trust people with your life. These people are making decisions based on paperwork and paranoia." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "I knew this day would come eventually. I was naive to think I could just disappear into a simple job and nobody would ask questions." "So what do you want to do?" Sarah asked. "You could quit tomorrow. You could work for me or start your own business or just not work at all." Marcus looked out their apartment window at the city lights. Somewhere out there was the building he had been cleaning every day, the floors he had walked in the quiet hours before dawn, the small corner of the world where he had found peace. "I want to keep cleaning floors," he said, "but I think it's time for people to understand why." Word spread through the building faster than Marcus had expected. By Thursday morning, everyone seemed to know that the quiet janitor had a military background that made building security nervous. Some employees looked at him with new respect, others with suspicion, and a few with the kind of curiosity that made him uncomfortable. Marcus was replacing light bulbs in the third-floor hallway when he overheard 2 executives from Precision Systems talking near the water cooler. They didn't notice him on his ladder, focused as they were on their conversation about quarterly projections and defense contracts. "I heard the janitor used to be some kind of special forces," one of them said. "Makes you wonder what he's really doing here." "Peterson thinks he might be industrial espionage," the other replied. "Someone with his background doesn't just decide to clean buildings. Has to be an angle." Marcus continued changing bulbs, his movements steady and practiced. These were the same men whose offices he had cleaned for months, whose coffee cups he had emptied, and whose waste paper baskets he had lined with fresh bags. He had never paid attention to the documents on their desks or the conversations he sometimes overheard. But now they were imagining him as some kind of corporate spy. The reality was much simpler and much more complicated. Marcus had chosen this job because it was the opposite of everything his military life had been. Instead of making decisions that affected hundreds of lives, he made sure the bathrooms had toilet paper. Instead of coordinating complex operations across multiple time zones, he followed a simple routine that let his mind rest. Instead of carrying weapons and wearing armor, he carried cleaning supplies and wore a uniform that made him invisible to most people. But invisibility, he was learning, was a luxury that his past wouldn't allow him to keep. During his lunch break, Marcus sat in his pickup truck in the parking garage and called Sarah. She was in meetings most of the day, but she always answered when he called. "How's it going today?" she asked, and he could hear the concern in her voice. "People are talking," Marcus said. "Word got out about my background. Some think I'm a spy. Others think I'm some kind of security threat." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to make some calls?" "I know people on the board of Precision Systems. I could explain the situation." "No," Marcus said quickly. "That would just make it worse. Then they'd really think there was some kind of conspiracy. So what's your plan?" Marcus watched other employees walking to their cars, most of them in expensive suits carrying briefcases or talking on phones. He had never wanted that life even before his military service. The competition, the politics, the constant pressure to prove worth through achievement, it all felt hollow to him. "I'm going to do my job," Marcus said. "Same as always. Maybe if they see that nothing changes, they'll realize their fears are unfounded. And if they don't?" Marcus started his truck, listening to the familiar rumble of the engine. "Then I'll find another building to clean." That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Marcus was mopping the lobby when a young man in a Navy uniform approached him. The insignia marked him as a petty officer, probably in his mid-20s, with the kind of nervous energy that Marcus remembered from his own early military days. "Excuse me, sir. Are you Marcus Chen?" Marcus paused his mopping and looked at the young sailor. "Depends who's asking. Petty Officer James Wright, sir. I'm stationed at the naval base outside the city." Wright seemed to struggle with how to continue. "Sir, I heard through some contacts that you were working here. I wanted to thank you." Marcus frowned, not recognizing the name or face. "Thank me for what?" "Operation Mountain Eagle, sir. Afghanistan 3 years ago. You led the team that extracted my unit when we were pinned down in that valley." The memory hit Marcus like a physical blow. He remembered that mission. 3 days of coordinated air and ground operations to rescue a reconnaissance unit that had been cut off by insurgent forces. 12 men had been trapped in a mountain valley with limited ammunition and no clear extraction route. Marcus had coordinated with multiple agencies to plan a rescue that required precise timing and considerable risk. "Right," Marcus said, the name finally clicking. "You were the communications specialist." "Yes, sir. I was sure we were all going to die in that valley. When we saw your helicopters coming over the ridge, it was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen." Marcus felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had carried the success of that mission, but also the knowledge that any mistake could have cost 12 lives. Wright and his team had gone home to their families because of decisions Marcus had made under extreme pressure. "You did your job, Wright. You kept your team alive until we could reach you." "Sir, I'm getting out of the service next month. I've got a job lined up with a tech company here in the city, and I was hoping—" Wright hesitated, clearly struggling with how to ask his question. "Sir, why are you working as a janitor?" Marcus leaned on his mop handle, looking at this young man who represented everything he used to be. Dedicated, eager, still believing that military service was the highest calling a person could have. He remembered feeling that way once before the weight of too many operations and too many life-or-death decisions had worn him down. "Because I needed to find a different way to serve," Marcus said finally. "Military service isn't the only way to contribute. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is something simple and honest that lets other people do their jobs." Wright looked around the polished lobby, at the gleaming floors and spotless windows that Marcus maintained every day. "I don't understand, sir." Marcus smiled, remembering his own confusion when older soldiers had tried to explain concepts that only made sense after years of experience. "You will someday. The question is what kind of person you want to be when you're not in uniform." After Wright left, Marcus returned to his cleaning with a new awareness of how his past kept intersecting with his present. He couldn't escape who he had been, but he was beginning to understand that he didn't necessarily have to. The skills that had made him an effective military leader, attention to detail, reliability, the ability to see problems before they became crises, were the same skills that made him good at his current job. The difference was scale and stakes. Instead of preventing international incidents, he prevented slip-and-fall accidents. Instead of coordinating million-dollar operations, he coordinated supply orders and maintenance schedules. Instead of leading soldiers, he worked quietly alongside people who didn't know they could depend on him until they needed to. That evening, Marcus came home to find Sarah working late in her study. She looked up when he entered, automatically saving her work and closing her laptop to give him her full attention. It was one of the things he loved about her, her ability to transition between her high-pressure business world and their private life. "Rough day?" she asked. Marcus told her about Wright's visit, about the recognition he couldn't escape, about the growing awareness among his co-workers that he was more than he appeared to be. "Maybe that's not a bad thing," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Maybe it's time for people to understand that there's dignity in all honest work, regardless of someone's background or capabilities." Marcus sat down beside her, pulling off his work boots and setting them by the door. "I just wanted to disappear for a while, to be nobody special, doing nothing important." Sarah reached over and took his hand. "But you are special, Marcus, and what you're doing is important, even if it doesn't feel that way. You're showing people that worth isn't measured by title or salary or recognition. You're proving that a person can choose to be exactly who they want to be, regardless of what others expect." Marcus looked at his wife, this brilliant woman who had built an empire from nothing and who somehow understood his need to build something much smaller and more personal. "What if they fire me? Then you'll find another job in another building and you'll clean those floors just as well as you clean these." Sarah squeezed his hand. "But I don't think they're going to fire you. I think they're going to learn something about leadership that they never expected to find in a janitor's closet." The crisis began at 2:17 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, when the fire alarm started screaming throughout the building. Marcus was on the 15th floor, cleaning windows in a conference room, when he heard something that made his blood run cold. Not just the alarm, but the sound of genuine panic and voices echoing through the hallways. Marcus had heard enough real emergencies to know the difference between a drill and actual danger. The voices were too urgent, too frightened. He abandoned his cleaning cart and moved toward the sounds, his military training automatically kicking in. 20 years of crisis response couldn't be turned off just because he wore a janitor's uniform instead of combat gear. In the hallway, he found chaos. Employees were running toward the stairwells, some crying, others shouting into their phones. The emergency lighting had activated, casting everything in an eerie red glow. Through the confusion, Marcus caught fragments of information. Explosion in the basement. Possible gas leak, someone trapped in the lower levels. Near the elevator bank, Marcus found Janet, his supervisor, trying to coordinate with building security, while tears streamed down her face. She grabbed his arm when she saw him. "Marcus, thank God there was an explosion in the mechanical room. The basement is flooding and we can't account for everyone. Tom Rodriguez went down to check the backup generators and hasn't come back." Marcus knew Tom, a maintenance worker in his 50s with bad knees and a tendency to take shortcuts. If there was flooding in the basement and Tom was injured or trapped, the building's evacuation procedures wouldn't be enough to save him. The fire department would need at least 15 minutes to arrive and assess the situation. Tom might not have that long. "Where's building security?" Marcus asked. "Peterson is coordinating with emergency services from the lobby. The security guards are doing floor-by-floor evacuation, but nobody wants to go down to the basement until the fire department gets here." Marcus looked around at the chaos, his mind automatically shifting into the operational mode that had once made him one of the most effective unit commanders in the military. He could see the problem clearly. Too much fear, not enough information, and a man's life hanging in the balance while bureaucracy and caution prevented immediate action. "I'm going down," Marcus said. Janet stared at him. "You can't, it's not safe. You're not trained for this." Marcus almost smiled at the irony. He had been trained for situations far more dangerous than a flooded basement, but Janet didn't know that. To her, he was just a janitor who was volunteering for something that should be left to professionals. I know the building layout better than anyone, Marcus said, which was true. I know where Tom would have gone, and I know the safest route down there. Before Janet could argue further, Marcus was moving toward the stairwell. His mind was already working through the tactical situation, potential hazards, escape routes, equipment he would need. In the emergency supply closet on the 14th floor, he found a flashlight, a basic first aid kit, and a length of rope that was meant for window cleaning, but could serve other purposes. The stairwell was filled with evacuating employees, all moving upward while Marcus pushed downward against the flow. Some recognized him and looked confused about why the janitor was going the wrong direction. Others were too focused on their own safety to care. As Marcus descended, the smell of gas became stronger, and he could hear the sound of running water echoing from below. The basement level was partially flooded, with about 6 inches of murky water covering the floor. Emergency lighting provided minimal visibility, and the air was thick with chemical fumes from whatever had exploded. Marcus waded through the water, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he called Tom's name. The mechanical room door was blown off its hinges, and inside he could see twisted metal and sparking electrical equipment. This wasn't just a minor accident. Something had gone seriously wrong with the building's infrastructure. He found Tom about 50 feet from the mechanical room, unconscious and partially submerged near a bank of electrical panels. Marcus quickly assessed the situation. Tom was breathing but had suffered a head injury, probably from flying debris. The water level was rising steadily, and the electrical systems were creating a dangerous hazard. Marcus's military training took over completely. He secured Tom's airway, checked for spinal injuries, and used the rope to create a makeshift stretcher that would allow him to drag the unconscious man through the water without causing further injury. Every movement was calculated, efficient, designed to minimize risk while maximizing the chances of getting both of them out alive. The evacuation was complicated by Tom's weight and the rising water level. Marcus had to navigate through flooded corridors while supporting an unconscious man, all while avoiding electrical hazards and the growing concentration of gas fumes. It took 15 minutes of careful movement to reach the stairwell. By the time Marcus emerged from the basement carrying Tom, the lobby was filled with emergency responders. Paramedics immediately took over Tom's care, while firefighters prepared to assess the basement situation. Peterson, the building manager, stared at Marcus with an expression of complete confusion. "What were you doing down there?" Peterson asked. "You could have been killed." Marcus was breathing heavily, his uniform soaked and covered with debris, but his voice was calm. Tom was trapped. Someone had to get him out. Agent Rodriguez, the Homeland Security investigator who had questioned Marcus earlier in the week, appeared at Peterson's side. She looked at Marcus with new understanding, seeing past the janitor's uniform to the trained professional who had just executed a textbook rescue operation under dangerous conditions. "That was incredibly risky," she said, "and incredibly professional. Where did you learn rescue techniques?" Marcus met her eyes steadily. "Same place I learned that you don't leave people behind." The paramedics reported that Tom would recover fully. His injuries were serious, but not life-threatening. And Marcus's quick response had probably saved his life. The building would need extensive repairs before anyone could return to work. But no other lives had been lost. As the emergency responders finished their work, Marcus found himself surrounded by employees who had witnessed his actions. Janet was crying again, but this time from relief and gratitude. Several executives from the upper floors, people who had never spoken to him before, were trying to thank him for his courage. "I don't understand," said one of the precision systems managers who had questioned his presence in the building. "How did you know what to do down there?" Marcus looked around at the faces watching him, some confused, some grateful, all seeing him differently than they had a few hours earlier. The secret he had tried to keep, the military background he had hoped to leave behind, was now impossible to hide. But instead of feeling exposed, he felt oddly relieved. "I used to be responsible for bringing people home safe," Marcus said simply. "Old habits." Peterson stepped forward, his earlier suspicions now replaced by something like awe. "Marcus, I owe you an apology. We all do. We were so worried about what you might do that we never considered what you might be willing to do for others." Agent Rodriguez nodded slowly. "I've seen a lot of heroes in my work, Mr. Chen. Most of them wear uniforms and carry weapons. But what you did today, That took a different kind of courage. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus realized that his quiet life as an invisible janitor was over. Everyone in the building now knew that he was capable of much more than cleaning floors. The question was whether they would understand that he had chosen to clean floors not because he couldn't do anything else, but because he wanted to contribute in a different way. Tom Rodriguez would go home to his family that night because Marcus had been willing to use his military training one more time. And maybe, Marcus thought, that was exactly why he had been meant to be in that building at that moment. Not as a former Special Forces commander, but as someone who happened to be in the right place with the right skills when someone needed help. The line between his past and present was blurring, but for the first time since leaving the military, Marcus felt like that might not be such a bad thing. The story hit the local news by evening, and by Monday morning, Marcus found himself at the center of media attention he had never wanted. "Hero janitor saves co-worker in building emergency," read the headline in the city newspaper, complete with a photo of Marcus emerging from the stairwell with Tom Rodriguez unconscious in his arms. Sarah showed him the article over coffee, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. She knew how much her husband valued privacy, how carefully he had constructed his quiet life away from recognition and responsibility. "Channel 7 wants to do an interview," she said gently, "and the mayor's office called about some kind of commendation ceremony." Marcus stared at the newspaper photo, seeing a stranger in janitor's clothes who looked nothing like the invisible maintenance worker he had tried to become. The man in the picture had the bearing of someone accustomed to crisis, someone who knew how to take charge when others were paralyzed by fear. "I just wanted to help Tom," Marcus said. "I didn't think about cameras or reporters." "I know," Sarah replied. "But now people want to understand how a janitor knew how to execute a perfect rescue operation. Your secret is out, Marcus. The question is what you want to do about it." Marcus returned to work to find the building transformed. The basement was still being repaired, but the upper floors were operational. More importantly, the way people looked at him had changed completely. Employees who had ignored him for months now stopped to thank him personally. Security guards nodded with respect rather than suspicion. Even the executives who had questioned his presence in the building treated him as an equal. Janet met him at the maintenance office with news that complicated everything. "Marcus, I've been getting calls all morning. 3 different companies want to hire you for security consulting. The mayor wants to put you on the city's emergency response advisory board. And Peterson says the building ownership wants to promote you to head of building security." Marcus looked around the modest office where he had found peace for over a year. The simple schedule board, the supply inventory sheets, the routine that had given structure to his healing. All of it felt fragile now, threatened by the attention he had never sought. "What if I just want to keep cleaning floors?" Marcus asked. Janet smiled sadly. "I think that ship has sailed, my friend. You can't put the genie back in the bottle." The real change became clear when Marcus encountered Agent Rodriguez in the lobby. She approached him with a file folder and an expression of professional respect that hadn't been there during their first meeting. "Mr. Chen, I've been reviewing your full military record. I owe you a significant apology. Your security clearance was higher than anyone else in this building, including the executives. We were investigating you as a potential threat when we should have been recognizing you as a valuable asset." Marcus accepted the apology with a nod. But Rodriguez wasn't finished. "I have a proposition for you. The Department of Homeland Security is looking for consultants with your background to help train civilian emergency responders. It would be part-time work, good pay, and you'd be helping prepare people for exactly the kind of situation that happened here Friday." The offer represented everything Marcus had been trying to avoid: a return to responsibility, leadership, making decisions that affected other people's safety. But it also represented something he hadn't expected: a way to use his military experience for purely constructive purposes. "I need to think about it," Marcus said. "Of course, but don't think too long. After what happened here, everyone wants to understand how to train ordinary civilians to respond like professionals in crisis situations." That afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Tom Rodriguez appeared at the maintenance office door, still showing signs of his injuries but insisting on returning to work. He had bandages on his head and moved carefully, but his eyes were clear and grateful. "I wanted to thank you properly," Tom said. "The doctors said I would have drowned if you hadn't found me when you did." The water was rising faster than anyone realized. Marcus set down his clipboard and really looked at Tom. This man in his 50s who had worked maintenance for 15 years, who had 3 grandchildren and a mortgage and no idea that his routine check of the backup generators would nearly cost him his life. "You would have done the same for me," Marcus said. Tom shook his head. "No, Marcus, I wouldn't have. I wouldn't have known how. I would have waited for the fire department like everyone else, and by then it would have been too late. You saved my life because you knew what to do when everyone else was scared." Marcus thought about all the other maintenance workers, security guards, and office employees in the building. Good people who worked hard and cared about each other, but who had never been trained to handle real emergencies. They had evacuated according to procedure while someone was dying in the basement because nobody else had the skills to help. "Maybe that's the problem," Marcus said slowly. "Maybe ordinary people should know how to help each other in emergencies." Tom smiled. "That sounds like something someone with your background should teach." That evening, Marcus sat with Sarah on their apartment balcony, watching the city lights and thinking about the crossroads he found himself facing. The building where he worked was visible in the distance, its windows glowing with the lights of people who now saw him as a hero, rather than an invisible maintenance worker. "Rodriguez offered me a consulting job," Marcus said, "training civilian emergency responders." Sarah turned to look at him. "What did you tell her?" "That I needed to think about it. But I keep coming back to what happened Friday. There were 300 people in that building, and only one person knew how to handle the emergency." "That doesn't seem right." Sarah reached over and took his hand. "You're thinking about taking the job. I'm thinking about what Tom said. Maybe ordinary people should know how to help each other. Maybe there's a way to use my experience that doesn't involve life or death decisions and classified operations. Teaching instead of commanding," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Preparing people instead of leading them into danger." Marcus nodded. "When I was active duty, I was responsible for elite soldiers who had years of training. But civilians face emergencies too, and most of them have no idea what to do. Maybe I can help change that." Sarah squeezed his hand. "What about cleaning floors?" Marcus smiled for the first time since the rescue. "Buildings will always need cleaning, and people will always need to know how to help each other when things go wrong. Maybe I can do both." The next morning, Marcus called Agent Rodriguez and accepted her offer, but with conditions. He would work part-time, developing training programs for civilian emergency response. He would focus on practical skills that ordinary people could learn and use. And he would continue his janitorial work, because that job had taught him something important about finding dignity in service. When he told Janet about his decision, she laughed and shook her head. "Only you would negotiate to keep cleaning toilets while becoming a federal consultant." "The toilets still need cleaning," Marcus said. "And the consulting work is just a few hours a week. I'm not ready to give up this job." Peterson was less enthusiastic when he learned about Marcus's new role. "You understand this changes your security status in the building. If you're working with Homeland Security, there are protocols we need to follow." Marcus nodded. "I understand. But I hope you also understand that I'm the same person I was last week. I clean floors well, I show up on time, and I help people when they need it. The government contract doesn't change any of that." Word of Marcus's new position spread through the building quickly, creating a strange dynamic. He was still emptying trash cans and mopping floors, but now everyone knew he was also developing emergency response protocols for federal agencies. Some employees seemed confused by the contradiction. Others began asking him questions about safety procedures and emergency preparedness. It was during one of these conversations that Marcus realized he had found something he hadn't been looking for, a way to bridge his past and present without losing either. His military experience informed his teaching, but his janitorial work kept him grounded in the everyday reality of the people he was trying to help. The first training session Rodriguez arranged was for the building's own employees. Marcus stood in the conference room where he had been cleaning windows when the emergency began, looking at 50 people who knew him as their janitor but were now listening to him explain how to respond to crises. "The most important thing to understand," Marcus told them, "is that you don't need to be a hero to help people. You just need to know what to do and be willing to do it. Emergency response isn't about being fearless. It's about being useful even when you're scared." He taught them basic first aid, evacuation procedures, how to assess dangerous situations without becoming victims themselves. But more than skills, he taught them confidence, the understanding that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences if they were prepared. After the session, Tom Rodriguez approached him with a question that surprised Marcus. "Would you teach my son these things? He's starting college next month, and after what happened to me, I want him to know how to help people." 6 months later, Marcus stood in front of a packed auditorium at the city's emergency management center. Looking out at an audience of firefighters, police officers, corporate security personnel, and civilian volunteers, he was wearing his cleanest maintenance uniform, the same clothes he wore to mop floors and empty trash cans, and the audience was hanging on every word. "The difference between a crisis and a catastrophe," Marcus said, clicking to the next slide of his presentation, "is often just one person who knows what to do and isn't afraid to do it. That person doesn't need to be specially trained. They don't need special equipment. They just need to understand that helping others is more important than following protocol." The presentation was part of a citywide emergency preparedness initiative that had grown out of Marcus's work with Homeland Security. What had started as consultation on training methods had evolved into a comprehensive program that taught emergency response skills to ordinary citizens. Marcus found himself at the center of something much larger than he had expected. After the presentation, Marcus was approached by Dr. Patricia Williams, the city's emergency management director. She was a former Army colonel who had transitioned to civilian emergency services, and she understood better than most what Marcus had accomplished. "Your program has been implemented in 12 cities now," she said. "The feedback is remarkable. People are responding to emergencies more effectively, and they're doing it with confidence rather than panic." Marcus nodded, still somewhat amazed by how far his simple idea had spread. People want to help each other. They just need to know how. "The mayor wants to offer you a full-time position as Deputy Director of Emergency Services. It would mean leaving your janitorial work, but the impact you could have—" Marcus held up a hand, smiling. "Dr. Williams, I appreciate the offer, but I've learned something important about myself over the past year. I work best when I keep one foot in the ordinary world. Cleaning buildings keeps me connected to the people I'm trying to help." Dr. Williams looked puzzled. "You're turning down a 6-figure salary to keep mopping floors?" "I'm keeping both jobs because they make each other better," Marcus explained. "When I'm developing training protocols, I think about Tom Rodriguez checking generators in a basement. When I'm cleaning offices, I notice potential safety hazards that most people miss. I need both perspectives." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the auditorium exit. Marcus turned to see a group of young people in military uniforms, students from the local military academy, who had attended his presentation. One of them, a cadet who couldn't have been more than 19, was arguing with his instructor about something. Marcus approached the group, and the argument stopped immediately. The cadet snapped to attention, recognizing his military bearing despite his civilian clothes. The instructor, a captain in the Army Reserve, looked embarrassed. "Sorry, sir. Cadet Morrison was just questioning some of your methods. He doesn't understand why we're learning civilian emergency response when we're training for military service." Marcus looked at Cadet Morrison, seeing his own younger self in the boy's earnest confusion. "What's your question, Cadet?" Morrison stood straighter, clearly nervous about challenging someone with Marcus's reputation. "Sir, I don't understand why military personnel need to learn civilian emergency response. Isn't our job to handle military operations?" Marcus smiled, remembering when he had thought the same way. "Tell me, Cadet, what do you plan to do when you leave the military?" "Return to civilian life, sir." "And will civilian life include emergencies?" Morrison looked uncertain. "Yes, sir, but you think civilian emergencies are somehow different from military ones? That the skills you learn to save lives in combat don't apply to saving lives in a flooded basement or a burning building?" Understanding began to dawn in Morrison's eyes. "No, sir. Lives our lives, exactly. And service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It just changes form." After the cadets left, Marcus found himself thinking about the full circle his life had taken. He had gone from commanding elite military units to cleaning office buildings, to teaching emergency response to both civilians and military personnel. Each phase had built on the others, creating something he never could have planned. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Saw the news coverage of your presentation. Very proud. Dinner at 8? Marcus smiled as he typed back. Wouldn't miss it. I'll be the one in the janitor uniform. Sarah had been offered partnerships and board positions at several companies that wanted to capitalize on her association with the hero janitor story. She had turned them all down, understanding that her husband's impact came from his authenticity, not from marketing opportunities. Marcus drove back to his building, where his afternoon shift was waiting. The basement had been completely renovated since the explosion, with new safety systems and emergency protocols that Marcus had helped design. Tom Rodriguez was already there, having returned to full duty with a new appreciation for safety procedures. How did the presentation go? Tom asked. Good, Marcus said, changing into his work clothes. The mayor offered me another promotion. Tom laughed. Let me guess, you turned it down. I've got a building to clean, Marcus said simply. As Marcus began his afternoon routine, he reflected on how much had changed in the past 2 years. He had started this job as a way to escape from leadership and responsibility. Now he found himself teaching leadership and responsibility to others, while still finding peace in the simple dignity of maintaining the building where it all began. The employees who worked in the building had become something like an extended family. They knew they could count on Marcus not just to keep their workspace clean, but to handle any emergency that might arise. More importantly, many of them had taken his emergency response training and now knew they could count on each other as well. At 6 p.m., Marcus finished his shift and headed home to Sarah. She was in her study, reviewing quarterly reports for her company, but she looked up with a smile when he entered. How many lives did you save today? She asked, their running joke about his dual career. No lives saved, Marcus replied, but I taught 30 people how to save lives. And I made sure all the fire exits are clearly marked and unobstructed. Sarah closed her laptop and came to embrace him, not caring that his uniform smelled like cleaning supplies. I'm proud of you, she said, for finding a way to be exactly who you need to be. Marcus held his wife, thinking about the unlikely path that had brought him to this moment. He had set out to become invisible, to escape from the weight of leadership and the burden of being responsible for other people's lives. Instead, he had found a different kind of service, one that combined the skills of his past with the humility of his present. He was still the man who had commanded elite military operations. He was also the man who noticed when the soap dispensers needed refilling. He was the federal consultant who designed emergency response protocols, and he was the janitor who made sure the floors were safe to walk on. People sometimes asked him if he missed his military career, if he felt like he was wasting his talents in maintenance work. Marcus's answer was always the same. Every form of honest service mattered, and the most important thing wasn't the uniform you wore or the title on your business card. It was being someone others could count on, whether they needed their floors cleaned or their lives saved. The building where Marcus worked had a plaque now, commemorating the emergency response that had saved Tom Rodriguez's life. It read, "In recognition of heroic action by building maintenance staff." Marcus had argued against including his name, insisting that the plaque should honor the principal rather than the individual. But everyone who worked in that building knew the story. They knew that sometimes heroes wore uniforms and carried weapons, and sometimes they wore coveralls and carried mops. The important thing wasn't the costume, it was the character of the person wearing it. Marcus Chen had learned to find dignity in service, regardless of its form. He had discovered that true leadership wasn't about commanding others, but about being the kind of person others could count on when counting mattered most. And he had proven that the most profound impact often came not from seeking recognition, but from simply showing up every day, ready to help in whatever way was needed. The CEO's husband still swept floors by day, but he had never stopped being a leader. He had just found a different, deeper way to serve.